Welcome to Dwell Church. My name is Matt Stefan. As I said, we are a church with 5 core values. We want to be Jesus-centered. We want to be research-based. We want to be trauma-informed. We want to be diverse. We want to be affirming and inclusive. And we're running an experiment to see what a church built on those things might look like. We are also trying to build a more participatory model of church. One of our dreams is many people speaking into what we do. We do that for a particular reason, and it's that we believe God speaks to everyone. So part of what we want to do on Sunday afternoons is to think about questions we are all feeling called to digest and metabolize together. So what we did at the start of the year, we do this every 6 months. We have it's something called community discernment. If you were here, you know we sit in tables and we dream, what would we do? What would each table do if they had 4 weeks of Dwell Church? They could do anything. They could rent an elephant. We could go skydiving. We could sit together in a full hour of silence, map out what would you do? What question would you ask? And we go for a little bit of extended time, and it's one of those few places where you get to ask yourself, what are my deepest spiritual needs? What are the deepest spiritual needs of the people I know? And how might a church address those needs? So we brainstormed together. It was really fun. Here's what we came up with. We're going to tackle these topics in these months that came out of the community discernment. This is the issues we're wrestling with, we think our world is wrestling with. So leading into our birthday, which will be in February, we'll talk about some of the mission, vision, values, and guts of Dwell Church. Part of what we want to do in that shorter series is jettison the words mission, vision, and value to talk about something else entirely. Church has been defined by those kinds of more corporate thinking, and we're trying to evolve beyond that. Then starting in March, we're going to talk about loneliness. Everyone has heard in one way, shape, or form that we are in what they are calling a loneliness epidemic. We are in another experiment to see what happens to humans when they live as isolated as we are living. And it's moving to me when the message that Jesus has given to us to love one another speaks so directly to the needs in our world. So we'll be talking about loneliness. Then we'll be talking about who exactly is this Jesus as we celebrate Easter. That's going to be amazing. Who is Jesus and what was he doing on that cross? Essential questions for our faith before us. In May, we'll talk about unlearning the Bible. How do we sort of deconstruct or decolonize or move away from what European white dudes thought about the Bible and towards biblical understandings that work better for us in our lives? That's going to be a fun one. In June, we'll talk about our core value of being an affirming and inclusive church. And in July, we'll talk about leveling up your conversation with God. So this is going to be a fantastic 5 or 6 months. Thank you to everybody who came to community discernment. Last 6 months ago when we were doing community discernment, one of the urgent questions was, what do we do with our suffering? And so that's what we are talking about today. Maybe you were feeling, well, wrong direction. That's the final slide. Help me, Eddie. That's the punchline to the whole sermon. Luckily, you have no idea what it means until I explain it all. It's perfect. Someday, my friends, it will be your turn, if it has not fallen to you yet, to be the person in the seat of the one who is suffering. And I wish that it wasn't so. But it is part of being a human being to have very real suffering in your life. And we're not just talking about this today because I am cleaning my garage. And that's how some of you are spending your holiday weekend. But instead, it is because it is an urgent question in our age. And it is an urgent question for our faith. Do we practice a faith that is up to the task of seeing us through very real, very significant suffering? Part of what we're going to talk about today is embracing the idea that suffering is normal. It is part of human life. And yet we have been trained to think that it will not be so. That maybe we will be the lucky ones. That if we play our cards right, if we run the right playbook, maybe it will be the dice falls in our favor. But I'm here to tell you that that is unlikely. In fact, maybe even not in your best interest. So today we will explore what does it mean for suffering to be normal. And as always, it will be our friend Jesus who is our guide. Jesus said some things. Wrong direction entirely. Almost there. Yes. Okay, we got it. Quite definitively, Jesus said this: "Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring plenty of worries of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today." Now that's right, thanks Jesus. In this passage, Jesus is encouraging us to not worry, but one of the foundational building blocks of his claim that we should not be worrying is that trouble is bound to happen. Today's trouble is enough for today. It is a virtual guarantee that each day of our life will have trouble of one sort or another. Let's see here. Yes. Elsewhere, Jesus said, "I have told you this, so that you may have my kind of peace. In this world you will have trouble." In fact, part of the claim that Jesus is making is if you think you won't have trouble, that will rob you of some peace. Part of what we want to tackle in this series is a problem that I have experienced in my life, that I have observed in a lot of people, that when it comes their turn to suffer, they are surprised and unprepared. And Jesus' kind of people ought to be unsurprised and quite prepared when your season of suffering arrives. So this week we're going to talk about normal suffering. Next week we'll talk about what might be called ordinary suffering. What's the difference between normal and ordinary? Normal means happens to everybody. Ordinary means it's the regular, everyday kind of misery that humans face. In part 3 of this series, the third week, we'll talk about extraordinary suffering, the mysterious kind that has no explanation, that is quite heartbreaking, that piles up all at once. This too, Jesus can see us through. What we're hoping to do is to build some emotional infrastructure so that when our turn in the seat of suffering comes, we are unsurprised and quite prepared. So we're wrestling through this, and part of the place that this series starts, that's the next one. Part of where this series ends is the grand promise of Jesus to be in it with us. And that, as we will see over these 3 weeks, is the primary differentiator, the defining trait of a Christian who is suffering, is that they are never alone and never without hope, because Jesus is with us. And so we get to take heart. The power, the presence of Jesus is with us, even in the mysterious kind, even in the kind that has no explanation, even in the kind that is deeply unjust, and even in the kind that has befallen you, or perhaps will someday in your life. We can still take heart. Where I want to start this reflection is the other way. Okay, I got it figured out now. Here's where I want to start talking about this with you. It's with a concept called emotional diversity. And here's where my reflection on emotional diversity begins. We have for 9 years been a member of the meal prep kit, Blue Apron. Every week, 3 to 5 meals come to our house. I chop them up. Sometimes the kids help. It's a blast. We've been doing it for longer than my daughter has been alive. I remember our first time because it was one of the few times in my life where I opened the salad and it went all over the kitchen. That happened to me our first night of Blue Apron. But later, our tradition became that my son, who is now 7, when he was 2, 3, and 4, he would sit on my shoulders 3 or 5 times a week while I prepped all those meals. We would chat about stuff. It was an amazing experience. So we were like all the way in on Blue Apron. They launched a wine pairing possibility for you. You had to pay a little extra. They'd send you a box of wine. It paired with your meals. And it came with this huge catalog. The most informative thing I've ever read about wine came from the Blue Apron wine pairing. Tasting wine is hard. If you taste it and they're like, there's a walnut in there, you're like, I didn't taste the walnut. I got nothing, right? This booklet really helped walk you through what part of your tongue, what you should be doing, how do you smell it. I loved it. One of the things I learned from it is that all French varietals have been replanted to have American roots, that the vineyards in France stole plants from America so that they could grow better, stronger, more tastier grapes. The reason they did this is because 150 years ago, there was a bug in France that killed almost all the wine and grapes and vineyards in the whole countryside. And so they said, what could we do? We need something with stronger, more robust roots. Where is wine sort of never grown and not known for? Well, 1850s America. Anything that's growing there probably has sturdy roots. And what they stumbled into was a kind of biodiversity that is wildly fruitful. It's actually hugely effective to mix up the kinds of plants and graft them together. That can be really fruitful for whatever you're trying to grow. Psychological researchers in Spain, who were also super into wine, said, I bet it's the same with emotions. So they developed this huge study, 39,000 people. And they tracked them for a year. Every day you had a diary. You wrote down, what did I feel and when and how intense was it? And they found that people who felt a broader spectrum of emotions more intensely were more healthy in their mind and in their body. It mapped to mental health and physical health, to have emotional diversity. But that's not the way our world trains us, is it? I remember when I first switched, I was at a church for about 5 years. And I loved it there, and I moved to a different church. Very painful experience for me. And a year later, I called somebody from the first church, and I was catching up with them, and they said, well, are you happy? Are you happy over there? And they meant it with the best intentions. But they reduced the entirety of my experience to this one question: are you happy? And we tend to think of that as the emotional bottom line in our world. And even if in our brain we're like, it can't be that simple, right? Maybe human life is not reduced to this one sentence. But in practice, in the ways that shape our soul, in the ways that we scroll, it really does fall to this one question: are you happy? See, our world is programming us for the thing that the research has said, it's the one certain way to arrive at mental illness: emotional monoculture. That's our one goal, right? We live our life that way. We make every decision that way. We make our relationship decisions that way. We make our work decisions that way. In human life, there is something called the knowing-doing gap, that if you know the right thing to do, that doesn't mean that you're going to do it. So Jesus, I think, in our world is coaching us away from emotional monoculture and towards emotional diversity by teaching us to embrace things that are of negative affect. See, the Bible is filled with passage after passage after passage where the main character is feeling quite intense negative emotions, and what are they doing? Offering it to God, and God says to them, gosh, that is a godly person who has cried out to me in anger or in heartbreak or in loneliness. But in our world, we shut off those feelings as best as we possibly can. So part of what our friend Jesus is doing in this series is inviting us to embrace that suffering is quite normal, especially as followers of Jesus. Because if we are patterning our lives after how he experienced the world, then of course our life will at some point end up with quite significant suffering. And so it is not for nothing that Jesus was described in Isaiah chapter 53 in this prophetic articulation, this grand poetry of what Jesus was going to be like. What would the Messiah be like when he comes? Would he be with lightning and a golden chariot? No, he would be hated, and men would have nothing to do with him. He would be a man of sorrows and of suffering, knowing sadness well. God in human flesh, this is the description they gave to us. And then his people will have said, we hid, as it were, our faces from him. Have you ever had someone in your life that was suffering in a way where you didn't know should you call them or not? It's a really painful circumstance to be in. That's what it means to hide your face from them. That you didn't know what to do, so because you didn't know what to do, you didn't show up. Part of what we will learn together, maybe not in this series, but certainly over the course of our life together is, gosh, you just show up. Don't hide your face from another. It's an essential way of relating to another human being. You just show up. Maybe you don't know what to do. Maybe you bring some soup. Maybe they hate soup. Doesn't matter. We will not hide our faces from each other. It's a deep commitment we will make together as a church. But the main takeaway here is, gosh, even Jesus, especially Jesus, was a man of sorrows. So if he didn't avoid the suffering, how foolish might we be to think that we possibly could? Again, not for nothing that Jesus spoke this way from the cross. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness all over the land until the 9th hour. And at about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is a quote from Psalm 22. Here Jesus is saying it's actually a normal and godly thing to occasionally in your life feel like, my God, why have you forsaken me? In week 3 of this series, we'll talk about why that is so important to God for you to show up there sometimes. But for now, let us just embrace. If Jesus is the one saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then it could be the case. It might be probable that you and I will eventually arrive there too. But here's where I think it gets real interesting. Not only does Jesus suffer. You might say, well, he's a human being. I get that. Not only does Jesus suffer, but so does God himself. Genesis chapter 6, real early in the story. God saw that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was altogether evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. This phrase, in his heart, is like in the center, in the core. In the core of God's being, he was grieving. And if you have felt like in the core of your being you were grieving, then you know this is real significant. God isn't bodily at risk here, and yet the pain he is feeling is about as profound and deep a pain as a being can be feeling. He is grieved in his heart. See, this suggests to us that where humans are concerned, see, God's grieving over humans. Maybe before he met humans, he was never grieving. We don't have a good sense of that. But early in the story, after meeting some people, he was grieved to his heart. What it suggests is that grief is built into the fabric of the universe, at least where humans are concerned. So you and I ought to be prepared, unsurprised, to find ourselves grieving. Now, part of this journey will be with this book here. Eleanor Stump is an analytic philosopher, famous person. And I guess I programmed that picture to disappear. It's great. Unlike our suffering. She's a brilliant philosopher. And she wrote this book reflecting on what we can learn about suffering from a philosophical point of view. From the Bible narratives about suffering, one of the things she observes is it was quite different a set of assumptions in medieval times. She's studying Thomas Aquinas. One of the problems that we have is, why do bad things happen to good people? We wrestle with that, right? They did not, strangely. They wrestled, why do some people live a life with no suffering? That was shocking to them. Suffering was so normal for most of human life that the only time they had raised a question was like, that guy just didn't seem like he suffered very much. There's a philosophical problem to be grappled with there, because suffering of very difficult, painful kinds was very normal in life. And yet, from the historical records, believers like us did not find their limited lifespans, the death of family members, they did not find that to be incompatible with their faith, or even practicing their faith with joy and celebration. There is a formula in here somewhere that this brilliant woman, Eleanor Stump, will help us uncover. But it is interesting to think that whereas we are plagued by this problem of why do bad things happen to good people, there is a group of human beings that were not troubled by that question. They were only troubled by, why do some people suffer and others do not? So part of what we're going to wrestle down is, why did we find ourselves so unprepared for suffering? Two quick pet theories here. One is called the hedonic treadmill. Have you heard this phrase? Here's how it works. Human beings have a natural baseline of like contentment in their life. It's different for everyone. Part of what you can learn as a human being is to alter your baseline. You can raise it. That's why we're doing the 30-day spiritual fix. Things like gratitude and encouraging one another, they can raise your baseline of general happiness and contentment. But the problem is, circumstances cannot. Sometimes this works for us. Sometimes a bad thing happens to you and someone says, time can heal all wounds. This is the hedonic treadmill. It's at work and it's helping you because you have a baseline of happiness. A bad thing happens to you, but a year later, you're like, okay, I've kind of moved on and I've returned to my baseline. But it works against us as well, because you could have something amazing happen to you and your happiness can go way up, and a year later you can be like, man, it's like nothing changed at all. And so one of the reasons we are unprepared for our suffering is we spend a lot of time trying to control our circumstances and almost no time trying to raise our baseline of contentment and peace and joy. And we are left unprepared for when the circumstances collapse, because we have been handed sort of the wrong formula in life to try to control your circumstances instead of the baseline interior experience of life. To walk the Jesus path is to walk that interior journey and ask questions like, gosh, am I grateful enough for what I have? And one of the painful things we will learn in this series is the more you suffer, the easier it is to say, I have enduring felt gratitude for what I got. That's something you only learn through suffering. So a reason we are unprepared is because this has us chasing that high every single time, avoiding suffering as much as we can because we think that is the formula to ultimately feel pretty good in life. We're programmed to try to avoid this suffering. Here's one more. We've got the wrong formula for our faith. Lisa really bravely last week was sharing her story at Story Night. Story Night's amazing. Hope you all will come to the next one. Hope you will go back and listen to those stories. It resonated with me deeply because I felt like I was living the same wrong formula. It was just this barely a sentence that she said. And it was, she thought that if she practiced her faith right, the bad things would not come her way. And this is the way we tend to assume faith will work. That if I do it, if I give it my best, if I show up, then some of these bad things won't happen to me. We practice our faith with a formula designed to avoid suffering when we ought to be practicing our faith with a formula that prepares us for suffering. So here is what I hope we learn. An invitation to enter the real. C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce depicts hell as a place where people are stuck, they're lonely, they've chosen to be there, and it's painful for them to even go outside because there is grass, and the grass is something real. And when they step on it, it hurts their feet that cannot tolerate reality. And as we try to avoid suffering, what we're doing is building an interior world that cannot tolerate reality. So our friend Jesus is strengthening us and inviting us to enter real life where there is profound beauty, but there is also great and terrible suffering. And when it is our turn, if we're ready, if we are prepared, what we will find is that Jesus will meet us in it. And this is why we constantly say, do you know what the good news of Jesus Christ is? We used to think that it was he died for our personal sins so we might one day escape and go to heaven. Maybe some of those things are true and essential. The resurrection of Jesus, most important thing to ever happen in human history. But his good news, the great proclamation, was that the kingdom of God was arriving, his presence into the world, into your life and into my life. And in the stories of suffering that we will study together, what is happening is that Jesus is showing up with his presence into people's lives, people like you and me. And so as we offer our suffering prayerfully to God, what we find is that he is faithful to be close to the brokenhearted. And so we shouldn't try to avoid that broken heart. It was always coming for us anyways. And it is the place where God meets us in deep and transformative ways. Let me pray for you. Jesus, we lift up our lives to you. We confess that we have been shaped in a certain way that leaves us surprised and unprepared. God, but would you train us and shape us to have a deep sense of your presence? God, so that along with the psalmist we could even say, even in the valley of the shadow of death, we have no fear, for you are with us. God, would you pour out your Spirit into these lives? We love you, Lord. Amen.